Thank you, Bernie, and thank you everybody for having me here. When I retired in the spring of 2010, I didn't think I would be back 4 years later talking about lung cancer, but stuff happens in life, and it's a real honor to be here and to be able to raise awareness about this critical issue. So thank you, Bernie, for that introduction. So I will say I'm also back at school getting my master's in public health to better allow me to be an advocate, and that's at UConn. I was there last year as a non-degree student because I missed the deadline. So I've got 4 classes under the belt, got accepted, so here I am. And I'm also working part-time as a consultant to the Leahy Hospital and Medical Center, helping them with their lung cancer screening research projects. It's a pretty long commute, 2.5 hours each way, and the traffic is pretty bad. But I go up there about once a week now. During the summer, it was a couple of times a week before I was in school. But Leahy Hospital and Medical Center, they're my heroes. And they started a free lung cancer screening program. I'm going to talk lung cancer screening here in a minute, in January of 2012. And they will screen anybody for free. So they're amazing. And I wasn't really looking for a job, and I'm not doing it for the money. But when I connected with them and they asked me, I couldn't say no. All right, so why don't we go ahead and get started. So I'm going to talk about, in true Pratt & Whitney tradition, I will tell you that I've got way too many slides. So I'll say that up front. So I'm going to tell you about Dan's story. We'll talk some about lung cancer statistics, talk a little about what lung cancer is, the risk factors, sort of natural history and treatment, and then we'll talk about lung cancer screening. This is the most important part. And then we'll get into the tobacco control piece and talk a little bit more about other things that tobacco affects from the standpoint of disease, and we'll summarize. Okay, so Dan's story. How many of you here knew Dan? Okay, so there's a few of you. So after I retired the end of April in 2010. For the first year and a half, we basically, did all the retirement stuff. We did a little bit of traveling, not a whole lot, but just sort of relaxed. And then in October of 2011, well, let's back up a little. In September of 2011, Dan started to have a pain in his side. I was going to Spain to visit my dad because I hadn't seen him for a while, and Dan wasn't going to come because he had other some comorbid conditions. He had type 2 diabetes, and he had some issues with his eyesight, so he didn't really want to come on the trip. But I said, well, I'm not going until you go to the doctor and figure out what it is. He said, oh, I remember now. I was in the supermarket, Stop and Shop, helping the lady. She asked me to get a pot pie from a top shelf somewhere in the freezer. So he went and stretched. He said, I just stretched my muscle. I'm like, okay. So I go to Spain. I come back. Well, it hadn't gotten any better. So this was towards the end of September. And we went to see our doctor. We have the same primary care physician. And the doc said, well, I think it's your gallbladder, so I want you to get an ultrasound, but let's just get a chest x-ray just in case it's, you broke your rib or something. So we go home. A couple of hours later, we get that phone call you never want to get. So long story short, the end of October 2011, Dan was diagnosed with stage 4 lung cancer, adenocarcinoma. He had metastases throughout his lungs. He basically had 2 big tumors, one up here and one down here, and his right 7th rib, and that's what had been hurting him, and that's the symptom, which is typically what happens with lung cancer, is there aren't many symptoms. So by the time he was diagnosed, there wasn't much of a shot for him. So anyway, the next year and a half basically was all about, doing the engineer thing, doing a deep dive, finding out all the data, reading about all the clinical trials. Basically, we did almost everything. We did expert consults with 2 of the top lung cancer specialists in the world, one at Dana-Farber and one at Yale. We did clinical trials. We pursued investigational new drugs, all sorts of stuff. But unfortunately, as is the case, when you have a late-stage diagnosis, it was too late. And so Dan passed away on April 13th last year. Excuse me, April 12th, 2013. It's a good sign that I don't know the exact date, right, Jane? So anyway, so I decided during that journey with Dan, I got pretty involved in going deep. We had a great oncologist. He was able to partner with us. I would go do all the research because he didn't have time for it. And so I'd come and say, okay, Dr. Election, how about we try this, we try that? And he'd go take a look at it and say, oh yeah, that's a good idea or not. He was wonderful. I mean, he did stuff that he didn't know how to do, and we figured it out together. But 2 months before Dan died, I wrote this very long, impassioned email to him, poor guy, about how we needed to change things about lung cancer, and we needed to do two things. We needed to find it earlier, and I was aware that there was this lung cancer screening test that I'm going to talk about, and we needed to help patients, empower patients, and give them information so that more people could get different kinds of treatment. So he said, okay, I'll put you in touch with someone. Well, it took forever, so I wasn't waiting for that. 4 days after Dan died, I called our primary care physician. I said, okay, doc, I want to come brief all your, because he was the chief medical officer of his practice. I said, I want to come brief all your guys on lung cancer screening, and then I want you to start talking to people about it. He told me all the reasons why we couldn't do that, and I told him all the reasons why we had to do that. All of a sudden, he just totally changed his mind, and he said, Andrea, you're right. We're going to do this. He called me back a week later, and he said, Andrea, one of the things I realized when I was talking to you was by not talking to my patients about this, I was making the decision for them. So anyway, so that's Dan's story. Okay, lung cancer is the second leading cause of death in the United States. The first leading cause is cardiovascular disease. A lot of people don't know it is the leading cause of cancer deaths in both men and women. A lot of people think breast cancer kills more women, but actually lung cancer kills twice as many women as breast cancer. 160,000 die each year. The 5-year survival rate is 16.8%. That's pretty much unchanged since 1975. It is the most common cancer in the world, 1.6 million deaths in 2012 worldwide. So if you just compare it to a few other things, I got some quick statistics slides. AIDS, 17,000, breast cancer, 40,000, and we already know lung cancer at 160,000. And this is just showing you the relative rank of all the different cancer deaths from a percentage standpoint in both men and women. And you can see at the top of the list is lung and bronchus for both men and for women. And you can also see the next one down, it's a significant difference. You go from 28% for lung and bronchus to 10% for prostate. Similar kind of thing. Lung cancer is almost double breast cancer, the next one down for women. What's the risk? 1 in 13 if you're a man, lifetime risk of getting lung cancer, 1 in 16 for women. If you take a look at who gets diagnosed, less than 40% of diagnoses every year are in people who currently smoke. There's about 224,000 diagnosed every year. Of those, about 50% used to smoke, former smokers, and there's about 10 to 15%. It's getting to be a little bit more every year, about 15%, I would say, of people who have never smoked. And the second leading cause is radon, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. This just shows the trends. We're engineers. In many cases, we like data. So if you take a look at lung and bronchus, that peak that you see right there coincides with when men started to smoke heavy duty in World War I. In World War I, they came out with a cigarette rolling machine. It became a little bit easier to make cigarettes, cheaper, and the tobacco companies provided kits for the soldiers in their little packs. They got chocolate and they got cigarette rolling machines and tobacco. That's now turned around. There's been a significant effort at tobacco control and smoking cessation, and so the rates are coming down. If you take a look at women, they're just starting to turn around right here, because women didn't start smoking until World War II. Rosie the Riveter, she had a pack of cigarettes right on her arm, and women were not as quick to stop smoking. If you remember the Virginia Slims ads in the 1980s, they encouraged women to smoke. And this just shows that from the standpoint of lung cancer in women, if you take all the other female cancers combined, lung cancer kills more than those. 5-year survival. This is a great chart because it shows all the different kinds of cancers and what happened. Almost all of them have increased survival, 5-year survival rates. If you take a look at lung and bronchus, 12, 13, 18, not very impressive. The main reason for that is because we don't find it early enough to be able to cure it, but that's going to change. This just takes a look at globally, and what that shows is the blue is the incidence, how many new cases you get of lung cancer every year worldwide by region. The red is the mortality. You can see that the lines are almost exactly the same because if you take a look at mortality to incidence rates, it's 0.87%, once again showing the poor survival. The emerging 58% of new cases are in underdeveloped regions, so these are the parts of the world where people are still smoking. There's also pollution in China. And in China, a lot of people started smoking, especially males, about 25 years ago. So their lung cancer rates are actually increasing at this point. These numbers in Africa are probably a problem with reporting and just data. I don't think they're really that low. In general, worldwide, the incidence for men is coming down. For lung cancer, the incidence for women is going up, except in North America where we've turned the corner. So what is lung cancer? It's a non-infectious chronic disease. What does that mean? What that means is it's not contagious, so you can't catch it for someone else. What chronic means is it takes a long time to develop. Basically what cancer is just you get damage in the DNA of your cells, and so the mechanisms for controlling cell growth are damaged and can't take over anymore. It typically takes hundreds of thousands of mutations to your DNA to cause cancer, and that includes lung cancer, so it takes many years of exposure to a carcinogen. Most cancers arise in the cells that are duplicating in the body. So in epithelial cells, which are both your glandular cells and the linings of your skin or the inner linings. So in the lungs, the cancer arises in the epithelial linings in your lungs, in the bronchi, the bronchioli, and the alveoli. The really bad thing is that today smokers are actually more likely to develop lung cancer than smokers 50 years ago. And the reason for that is because the tobacco companies have spent billions of dollars putting additives and changing their delivery methods in their cigarettes to make them even more carcinogen and to even make them more addictive. So it's almost, you can't get away from it. What's the histology of lung cancer? If you have lung cancer, the majority are non-small cell lung cancer, and the majority of those are adenocarcinoma. This is just an info slide for you all if you... Okay, now there's going to be a quiz at the end on this flow chart. Over 80% of lung cancers are caused by tobacco, and basically it's just the exposure to all the carcinogens in the smoke that drive the mutations in the DNA that end up causing lung cancer. And if anybody's really interested, we can talk offline about this one. So what other risk factors are there for lung cancer? Secondhand exposure to smoke. There's about 42,000 deaths in the US due to secondhand smoke exposure. Radon, there's about 25,000 in the US due to radon. Do you all know what radon is? Yeah. And also just in the soil, not only in the water, but also in the air. In Connecticut, I know when we bought our house, you have to have a radon test to check radon levels. Now, if you haven't had that and you haven't checked your houses, I would definitely suggest you go to Home Depot. They have the little kit. You can put the little vials in your basement and send them into the lab. And then if you have a well, you might want to check your water as well. But there's a lot of radon in the United States. And there's a lot in Connecticut especially. There's some areas, I know in our street, there's a couple of houses that actually have radon remediation systems. I have a brochure over there on radon. If you had some other type of smoking-related cancer, and I'm going to go over which ones those are, but for example, bladder cancer is smoking-related, then it increases your risk for lung cancer. If you have a family history, so Dan's sister died of lung cancer at age 62. Both of them had been quit for about 10, 11 years before they were diagnosed. There is a dose-response relationship with smoking and lung cancer, so the more you've smoked, the more likely you are to get lung cancer. And there's environmental pollutants. Pollution, worldwide, there's 225,000 deaths due to pollution, dust, asbestos. And then if you have COPD or pulmonary fibrosis, you're more likely to get lung cancer as well. Most COPD cases are brought on by smoking as well, so it's a dual whammy from that standpoint. The natural history of lung cancer. So what happens? I'm going to take you through using Dan's thing. So you have DNA damage to cells, and it accumulates with age. So the average age of diagnosis for lung cancer is age 70. And that's because it takes a while for the damage to come in as you smoke. Obviously, the more you smoke, the quicker the damage can come. But if you're like a pack-a-day smoker for 30 years, then that's how you're building up that. So results in abnormal cell growth. You get a lesion, which is just another word for a tumor. Pathological evidence means that if they look, they can actually find that you have cancer before you have symptoms. And there's very few symptoms in the early stage, and I'm going to show you what those are in the early stages. So if there's no screening and there's no symptoms, then you don't find out until you get symptoms. By the time you have symptoms, the lung cancer has spread, and the chances of a cure are pretty small. So diagnosis, if it's advanced enough, you can generally see it on an X-ray. Otherwise, you would have to do a CAT scan, and then once they see something, then you go in and do a PET scan, which is essentially they inject a radioactive glucose into your system, and cancer eats it up and starts glowing. And so when you take a look at it on an X-ray kind of image, you can see where the cancers are. Biopsies, magnetic resonance imaging, typically they use that for the brain. Lung cancer tends to spread to the bones, the liver, and the brain. Those are three common areas. About 50% of people who have lung cancer have it spread to their brains. Luckily, Dan didn't have it spread to his brains. That's a bad way to go. And then we'll talk a little bit more about treatment. Early stage, you can go for a cure with surgery. And late stages is basically systematic and chemotherapy, radiation. And there's also some new treatments out nowadays that we'll talk about on another slide. And then we've already talked that 5-year survival is pretty low. It's 16.8%. If it's localized, the data shows 54%, but we've got data now that shows if you have a screen-detected lung cancer, 5-year survivals can be up to 90%. So that's pretty exciting. Okay, so how do we treat it? We talked about surgical. If you find it when there's just one small pulmonary nodule, you can go in minimally invasively even and take that out. So the earlier you find it, a lot of people have told me when I've talked to them about this, well, I don't want to know. And that's because it's such a horrible, it's almost like they say, it's a death sentence to find out you have lung cancer. I don't want to know about it. Well, that's okay, but it's going to happen regardless. So at this point, what I'd like to do is tell people that there's hope because there is a screening test. We'll talk in more details. And if you find it early, the surgery is not that bad. And you go in, you take a little piece out, and depending on how big the tumor is, where you find it, when you find it, there's different options from the standpoint of how much of your lung they take out. They can now just take a wedge out as well. So they don't have to, in the old days, they used to have to take one whole lung. They don't have to do that anymore. And sometimes if you do get